Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual panel about climate and agriculture. My name's Lee Constable. I'll be your host for this. And our question that we're going to title together with is how can climate scientists work with the agricultural industry to adapt to climate extremes? Now, before we launch into the panel, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you today from Gadigal and Bidjigal land. So I wanted to acknowledge our elders past and present, and of course, their ongoing relationship with the land and sea and sky. A lot of these things that we're going to be talking about today. And I also wanted to introduce each of our guests first, and then I'll go into some Q&A. Now, you might be watching on Facebook or YouTube. Wherever you're watching, you'll see you can comment. The great thing about being virtual is that you're allowed to have a bit more of a comment than a question as well, but questions are encouraged. So throughout, if something comes to mind and you have a question for the whole panel or one person in particular, type it into the comments and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I know lots of people have already submitted questions as well that I have in front of me, so thank you for that. And make sure that you also are having discussions amongst yourselves. You're allowed to. That's the great thing about being able to do things virtually too. So if you've got an insight, whether you're a farmer or someone who works in climate or someone who works in both, please share them in the chat as well. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our guests. The first guest I'm going to introduce to you is John Welsh, who is the Principal Climate Analyst and Economist at Ag Econ. Welcome, John. John has an impressive bio, I'm sure you'll all see. He's very skilled in evaluating investment risk and farm technologies, as well as analysing and communicating the cyclical nature of key climate influences affecting Australian agriculture. He's got 20 years of hands-on livestock and grain production experience, and prior to his current role, he was a project lead of the Cotton RDC's extension with the Department of Ag. So welcome, John. We'll have more questions for you soon.
Thanks, Lee.
And now I'm going to introduce Professor Jason Evans. Professor Jason Evans is from UNSW Sydney and of course is part of our host organisation, the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. So Professor Evans' expertise is in the area of regional climate change and its impacts. Jason leads research finding improved techniques to combine data with regional climate and land surface models to help solve problems of national and international significance. Jason is a science advisory team member of the World Climate Research Programme's Cordex program and coordinator of the Australasia domain. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Lee.
And finally, last but not least, I will introduce to you Dr. Yawen Chow. She is a research associate at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. Yawen is currently developing new methods for bias correction in climate models in order to optimise the projections of climate extremes. So her PhD aimed to develop a trend-aware forecast post-processing method to embed the historical trends into sub-seasonal to seasonal climate forecasts, something very important for a lot of farmers. Yawen is interested in communicating her research for the benefit of industry, which is why we're all here today. Welcome, Yawen.
Thanks for the introduction, Lee.
No problem. Now, I'll go back to the first guest I introduced, John. I just wanted to give you an opportunity, John, to let us all know what got you interested in climate or that interaction between climate and the ag industry?
Sure, Lee. I guess from an ag production point of view, coming home in the mid-90s to a family farm and in a cattle and grain production context, we seem to be getting once-in-a-generation droughts every 4 or 5 years. And the old timers used to say, well, you know, this hasn't occurred before, and this is so strange. And yeah, I guess the inquiry or the appetite to explore these cyclical influences was really off the back of trying to manage a business and noticing that the climate, you know, the rain and extreme temperature events, whatever, could change agricultural supply and demand. Underpinned by the climate. So it was obviously a next step to try and, you know, anticipate the cyclical nature climate and understanding the geography and where we lived in that location and what the influences were, with the view to anticipating those, potentially to manage a more resilient business. The first inquiry sort of came to Mike Pook one day. I contacted him, a CSIRO climate researcher out of the blue, maybe known to some of you, and he suggested I contact the Japanese researchers at the time. This was going back to 2007, I think it was, and those guys entertained the thought of educating me to, the impacts of Madoki and the IOD on our climate in Western New South Wales. So that was fascinating, and therein lies the hobby or the interest in the climate, and then I had an opportunity to work with the cotton research from 2013 onwards, and I've been doing that job, the climate risk side of things in terms of extension, and it's been quite a really enjoyable job because I can share my own experiences with trying to understand the science and putting it in context to agricultural decision making, something I'm still passionate about, particularly given the uncertainties around the climate moving forward, and how improving climate literacy can certainly really add some value in terms of any business looking to manage their risk to become more resilient. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, and awesome to hear about you as a farmer reaching out to climate scientists. Our next guest is a climate scientist who reaches out to farmers, I would say. So I'll come back to you, John, with more questions, but now I'll pass on to Jason. Jason, I wanted to ask you a similar question. What was your journey into what you now research today?
Well, I was always been interested in trying to understand how things work. And so that led me to studying physics and mathematics at the beginning. But once you've got the skills in mathematics and knowledge of physics, you can really apply those to many, many different kinds of problems that we face in the world. So for me, I was really interested in what appeared to be probably the biggest challenge that we're facing in my lifetime, and that's climate change. And if we are changing the climate, exactly how do we deal with those changes and adapt to them? And that meant really needing to understand how these changes to the global climate system that we're forcing manifest themselves at local and regional scales, because they're the scales that we can actually make decisions on. We can actually change the things we do to try and deal with the changing climate that we're experiencing. So that's what led me to my field, which is really trying to bridge that gap from the global changes we're causing down to the local impacts of those changes and what that means for human and natural systems, including agriculture.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. And again, everyone, please do feel free to write in the chat if you've got any comments, but also questions for our panel as well. From Jason to Yawen, I now wanted to ask you the same question again. Now, we heard in Yawen's bio at the start how your PhD was really related to this topic, but where did your interest in climate science and agriculture begin?
Yeah, I think personally, my journey to climate science starts with my PhD experience because my PhD supervisor is a specialist in hydroclimate forecasting. So my PhD research follows his step in developing a new technique to post-process the subseasonal to seasonal temperature and precipitation forecast in Australian. So when I say subseasonal to seasonal forecast, that refers to the prediction of the climate conditions from 2 weeks to up to 1 year ahead. So when I was doing that 4-year PhD project, I just feel passionate about doing research in climate modeling and forecasting. Then I continued my research in the field of climate change projection during my postdoc work. So now I'm also trying to develop new technique to trying to improve the projections of the future few decades to a century. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm
so
sure
that is my story till now.
And I'm sure a lot of people listening, particularly if they're involved in agriculture, would love, more and more detailed and accurate and different timescale projections. So I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you on that as well. I'll bring everyone back on screen now because we're going to have more of a group discussion. Like I said earlier, we've had lots of questions pre-submitted, and I'm sure we'll have more questions come through live. A lot of people who are asking questions are people who work at this intersect of ag and government, ag and scientific research, all three even, and are asking about what needs to happen to actually connect. I know Peter Gallagher from ACOM actually asked, I'm interested to hear the panel's perspective on how climate professionals can best engage with farmers to enhance the adaptation discussions and outcomes. I'm sure you've all got a perspective on that, but maybe first, John, you can say from a farmer perspective what the best way is.
Look, I think in the cotton industry in particular, they've invested in climate extension in the form of myself and a couple of other professionals in the industry. And that's just connected our farmers with that research in such an invaluable way. It's a terrific model for other industries. I know that Dale Gray does a similar thing for grains in Victoria and southern New South Wales. And climate literacy of growers and advisors in those areas is just astonishing, as opposed to some other sectors and areas of agriculture. Sugarcane, for example, doesn't have a position in their industry to bridge that gap between the science and the advising community, the agronomists and the growers. I think ag industry, each sector has to take a little bit more leadership, and I know it's hard to find the people with the right skills, but certainly, the test of time has shown that extension, bridging that gap between the R&D, people like Jason, Andrea and all the other really valuable researchers we've got in Australia doing really, really neat things. It's such a shame to see a lot of that research not get the full light of day that it deserves. We have agronomists and farmers in particular asking us really, really detailed questions because they've been on the journey with us since 2013-14 when the position was taken from cotton to invest in this area. Some of which now require scientists to answer grower questions because I just don't know the answers to them, and that's just a terrific place to be when we've got the literacy just improving that much. People are running better businesses with greater knowledge due to just simply communication and packaging things so people can understand what's going on with the science and not just look at color-coded computer models.
Yeah, and it's often a two-way exchange as well. The farmers inform scientists, and science can inform farming. Jason, there's a similar question that was submitted from Graham Sandrill at GRDC, who said, "How will climate information provided by the centre improve my decision making around probability of outcomes for on-farm decisions?"
Yeah, that's a really good question. First, I might just echo a little bit of what John just said, and that is that the value of people like John that can really bridge the gap between climate scientists like myself and the agricultural industry people is really, really valuable. I'm not an expert in agriculture. Most farmers aren't experts in climate and climate change. We don't necessarily speak the same language. So having someone like John that's able to speak the languages of both sides is a position that is really hard to replicate any other way. So I want to just agree with John and the value of that kind of role. So to the question you asked, Lee, so a lot of the Centre of Excellence work is really focused on what climate change means for changes in climate extremes. We've got to the stage where we're pretty good at projecting changes in mean climate. But of course, for most of us, including agricultural industry, a lot of the risk is actually associated with the climate extremes, so extreme climatic events that occur. And so trying to understand how those kind of events might change beyond how the mean climate changes is really the key focus for what we're doing in the centre, and bringing that level of information to questions around agriculture and how it might be impacted in the future, I think is a key role that we're trying to fill through the centre. Of course, one of the key factors here is that while we can do the mean climate changes really with quite high confidence in a lot of cases for a number of different kinds of climate extremes, we still only have probably low confidence in how we think they're going to change because of climate change. And part of the job we're doing in the centre is trying to improve our knowledge and our models and improve our confidence around those particular extremes and how they're going to change.
Yeah, and quite often the questions that farmers are asking are the same ones that climate researchers are asking themselves and trying to figure out every day. Yawen, on the topic that Jason just brought up about, speaking the language, I wanted to ask you about the term climate indices. So what are these indices? And if you can give some examples, and how do they impact farmers in the ag industry?
Yeah, sure. So the climate indices are usually calculated from the daily or sub-daily climate data, and they can provide some condensed information about the main climate conditions and some extreme events. And they can characterize the events in terms of like location, frequency, intensity, duration, occurrence timing, and so on. And usually the collection of such indices can help to provide a comprehensive view of like how the extreme events varied in the past and how they may change in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And you may know that many temperature and precipitation indices are relevant to agricultural activities. For example, the index force days, that is defined as the number of days when the daily minimum temperature is below 0 degrees in the growing seasons. And the other temperature example is the warm day frequency. It measures the percentage of days when the daily maximum temperature is above the 90th percentile. And for the precipitation, there are also some indices related to agricultural activities. For example, the maximum consecutive 5-day precipitation in a growing season. And for the drying conditions, an example is the maximum length of dry spell, which is calculated as the maximum number of consecutive days when the daily rainfall amount is lower than 1 millimeter. And usually the relative high values of these indices can be indicative of the climate conditions that may pose some threats to the farming activities or the living condition of the livestock. So for the future, I feel that the in-time prediction and the effective communication of these extreme events between the climate scientists and the researchers or the farmers can be important to give the warnings of these extreme events and enable the farmers to take in-time actions to eliminate the climate risks to them.
Yeah. And I can imagine that being really important to a lot of farmers. If there's going to be consecutive days of rain and you've got, some fruit that you could harvest now or next week, if you've got animals and there's going to be consecutive days of below 0, like you were talking about, there's different parts of the farm you might move them to so they can seek shelter and things like that. There's different ways you might think about your resources depending on how hot or cold it's going to be and how many days consecutively or how that's going to increase. So yeah, I can see why that would be important to a lot of people. If you're in the chat, feel free to let us know if there are any particular climate variables, things that you just think, if I could dream up something that I could know more about for what I do, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. So, John, explain to us how this climate science has actually helped you and what you do. What are some examples?
Well, certainly anticipating a shift. I mean, various studies have shown that climate information is really only valuable if it changes your point of departure and a decision in your business. And certainly with El Niños being well telegraphed at the start of the winter cropping season, for example, or the Indian Ocean dipole decaying at the end of a calendar year, for example, we know that hopefully there's an opportunity where we can prepare for those events, either not sowing a field down to a particular crop and fallowing that through to be defensive and save on costs is one example. So I think that, but again, we have trouble with uptake and encouraging people to be engaged in the science. The select few that are certainly engaged in the science do very well and make informed decisions, based on the information they've got at hand once they understand it. But still we have barriers with really smart people that are technically very proficient that are just disengaged, and we continue to work on those, and it's certainly an ongoing challenge to try and bring more people into these discussions, and not just at twice or three times of the year when they're planting crops, but all the time. Make it a routine part of their business to understand things, as a sort of ongoing concern.
Yeah, because like you say, some people could be really clued in and really connected, and other people, might miss out on some of this key information that could make a difference depending on the ways they engage and how they make their decisions.
That's right.
One question, we've got some specific questions that perhaps Yowan and Jason as climate scientists might want to comment on. Kim Walton from SA Drought Hub has asked if you can comment on increases in the number of days per year over 40 degrees Celsius, specifically in the South Australia Riverland. Do you have any sort of information you could give Kim, or somewhere to go to find out that information?
Well, I don't have that information at the tip of my finger right here, but you can certainly find that information through a number of ways. There's been a number of state-based initiatives that have brought together climate projections for the various states in Australia. For South Australia, I think it was called SA Ready, and so they have information available through that service. I think if you Google it, you'll find it on their webpage, and includes things like changes in future extreme temperatures and stuff. I don't know what the exact number would be for days over 40, but for these kind of variables, temperature-related variables, it's almost uniformly an increase into the future, which is substantially higher if we stick to a high emission pathway future. So there's really major benefits to be had if we can limit our emissions and be on a low emission trajectory in terms of how many more days you might see above these very high temperature thresholds like 40 degrees.
Yeah, and I guess that's an important point to bring up, is that predicting the future is, well, it's impossible, but also there are potential different pathways depending on what happens as far as emissions reductions locally and globally, because you certainly see in those IPCC reports the branching off of different scenarios and what that could mean. The other question that similarly is asking for advice, Grant Stone from Queensland Department of Environment and Science asked, what options are there for informing the industry of multi-year wet and dry periods?
Okay, that's a good question. Certainly in terms of dry periods, so there's been a fair bit of work on drought. There's actually a drought program in the Centre of Excellence where we're specifically looking at these extended dry periods. through, as I mentioned, the state initiatives before, through the various state initiatives, they all have some information around drought. I don't know that there's a lot around multi-year drought. I think mostly they look at seasonal to year-long type droughts. So depending on what state you're in, you'd have access to different information. In Queensland, they do have, I think you can access through the Long Paddock website, projections for Queensland that include drought and various changes in aspects of drought, like the duration or the severity, is available through that site. I guess it's worth mentioning at this point that while I'm talking about data you can go to right now, which in many cases come from state-based initiative, there is now a federal initiative called the Australian Climate Service, which is being created and getting up and running. So I would hope that, by next year, perhaps, we'll have nationally consistent information so that wherever you are in Australia, you'll be able to see the same kind of climate projection information rather than these purely state-based things that we have at the moment.
Yeah, something to look out for and look forward to. So hopefully, if you're watching and wherever you are in Australia, you've got a few good ideas about different places you can look for more information. One question I wanted to ask you, Yawen, going back to this post-processing methods. What is a post-processing method? And then, how does that relate to agriculture again?
Yeah, so you know that nowadays, almost all the predictions for the future climate conditions are coming from the sort of global or regional climate models. And usually these climate models refer to very complicated computing programs that can integrate the processes within or among all the Earth components, including like land surface, ocean, atmosphere, and sea ice. So these climate models can be visualized as a simplified Earth system. So because they are a simplified model, so they are usually associated with large systematic biases. So usually the model outputs cannot be directly trusted or apply for the other use. So we will need some post-processing techniques that try to improve the predictions from these climate models. So like currently, my work is trying to develop new bias correction and more model weighting technique to try to improve the predictions from these climate models from individual ones, and also try to improve the prediction of the uncertainty range for the future climate conditions.
Yeah, and I know that it's a lot of this stuff that goes on behind the scenes often, and things that people wonder about when they're like, why wasn't that accurate, or why don't we know this far in advance? So it's great to hear about ways that you're working at that kind of problem and solutions for that. Matt Pearce from New South Wales DPI also asked a question. Matt's interested in engagement methods which maximize impact of adaptation methods and adoption by producers. Anyone want to comment on maximizing the impact of adaptation and getting that adoption happening?
Yeah, certainly. Lee, from an extension point of view, you have to engage them when they want the information, and that comes at a time in the calendar year when when there's decisions to be made, and primarily the main one with grain, livestock, and cropping industries in general is the autumn season and the outlook for soft season rainfall. So the March-April period when they have to wean their calves or make some restocking or destocking decisions for their livestock business, or planting a crop or fallowing that field through to summer crop. So, you know, to answer the question you had, really the best time to get growers to adopt the uptake of information is when the demand is there, certainly. So it's quite a challenge to get traction with communications, with social media, with face-to-face engagements, unless, you know, you've got decisions to be made, and that information can add value to that business. So autumn's one time, certainly the springtime's another, when you've got the outlook for the monsoon season coming up in particularly northern half of Australia. For irrigators, it's certainly that August period when they're doing their water budgets for the coming summer crop. And then again in the middle of summer as well, you know, what's the outlook for the monsoon, what's the MJO doing, and other drivers is kind of good opportunities. But certainly March, April is a key time for most, you know, generally speaking, ag businesses when they're really got some decisions to make about the soft season rainfall outlook.
Yeah, so that's the time of the year, but what sort of, I guess, what sort of ways would you go about that engagement as well? And also I wanted to acknowledge Gary Allen, also from New South Wales DPI, was asking about effective adaptation, but his question was specifically about mixed farming with sheep and wheat.
Yeah, adaptation, I guess, starts with the engagement process for seasonal forecasting, and once you've got them involved in you know, looking at seasonal forecasts, then once they're in the room and engaged, then you can start to talk about, you know, adaptation in terms of mean state changing in the future, extremes changing, and all of those things. But until you can actually get them focused on seasonal forecasting and getting them engaged in that, and then you can branch off into other areas. But actually getting them, you know, signed on is you know, one of the greatest challenges that we have. You know, just, you know, the odd occasion that the growers and advisors seem to have a greater recollection of model failure than they do, you know, model success, and it's hard to bring them back in at times. There's all sorts of barriers, and there's been quite a few really interesting papers written on the barriers to adoption. But the main thing is to get them re-engaged in the science, to you know, to then keep exploring, like so many farmers do, that are really cognizant of the changes in the climate and how to manage the cycles and the influences, and then tactical decisions of managing extremes with you know, heat or really intense rainfall events as well. But that's a start anyway.
Yeah, and I know a lot of, I mean, basically all farmers are engaged in weather, if not climate itself. My parents are sheep farmers, and they've got the land newspapers printout with the where you can put your rain for each day in there, and they're always checking, you know, and recording those things. So it seems a good place to start. A question on
maybe I could just add one thing to that, Lee.
Yep.
So as running an agriculture business, of course, there is also some decisions that have much longer term impacts on what you're doing, or infrastructure you might want to consider building on your farm, or whether you might want to plant some tree crops that are going to take decades to really be fruitful. So when we're thinking about the climate changing, whenever you're considering questions that have that sort of time scale of sort of decade plus, I think those decisions are really the ideal decisions that you want to take a moment to think about how the climate's going to change in the future, and what that's going to mean for the investment in that kind of infrastructure on your farm. Because those longer term investments are often more costly investments, and whether they're going to achieve the outcome you're looking for could be dramatically influenced by the changing climate going forward.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you know, during a drought, you're more strapped for cash to implement the things that you might have wanted to do on farm to actually make your farm more drought resistant. But it is a good point that you've got to have those short-term and long-term plans in place. we've got a question on the topic of broadacre cereal farms. What are the options for broadacre cereal farmers to manage climate extremes like increasing drought, frost, excess rain in some places? This question comes from Uday Nidamulu from CSIRO. Any insights for that question?
Yeah,
John?
certainly. Yeah, absolutely. Crop rotations, choosing the right species for the climate. You know, if we're coming into a particularly wet spring, like we could be this year with the IOD being in the wet phase, you know, that's not a good time to be a pulse crop with disease and waterlogging, for example. So this would be a year where you'd manage, you know, that risk with planting cereals, for example. Whereas, you know, in a particularly dry time, you know, chickpea species may be better that are more drought hardy, that have got a deep taproot. So, and it's making sure that the species you grow are healthy and making the most out of whatever available rain is there quite often. And that, you know, that's achieved through good disease status and fertility with your crop rotation. So that's just one example.
Yeah, great. And Pandora Hope's actually got a question from Bomb. Climate, she says, and this relates to your research, Yarwin, climate scientists are interested in providing details about the likelihood and frequency of certain climate-related thresholds, e.g. 1 hot season in a region, or 3 hot nights, or 2 dry seasons back to back. She wants to know, though, would that information be useful to farmers? And can you tell us more about these sorts of thresholds that are of most relevance to agriculture?
So I think all the information about the main climate states and these climate extremes can be closely relevant to the agricultural activities, because there have been many studies showing that the climate variation can explain part of the crop yard on farms. And there are studies showing that the increase in the climate extremes may have negative impact on the production from the agricultural industry. And so, because I haven't got any direct content with the farmers, so I'm not sure about the certain threshold for these climate extremes that can throw the severe threats to the farmers. So that is what I would like to call for from the agricultural industry, that is, we would like to know some specific user relevant climate indices that can be important to the farmers or some site researchers. And what if we have no such information from the farmers? Then we are keen to do more research on those and try to understand what kind of climate conditions will be important to them, and how we can try to improve the predictions of these climate conditions and extremes, and make our research more beneficial for the on-farm management in that case.
Yeah, I'll go to you, John, soon for your perspective as well. But before I do, just reiterating that this is a great invitation to any farmers who might be watching this right now or watching back, that people who are climate scientists like Yarwin want to hear from you about what things are important to what you do on farm. So if there are things that would make your work as a farmer more lower risk or make you more able to plan and do what you do on farm, you know, get in touch with the Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes, let them know they want to hear this information from farmers so they can then help that inform what research they do. John, from your perspective, what information would be useful to farmers?
Look, I think the information we've got is really valuable, but it's more so engaging the majority that really need to be brought in enlightened with what we can do with what we've got. The utilisation of the current information is poor, I think, in a lot of cases. Those that are on the journey are reaping the benefits of that and managing their risk really well. But there's a lot of farmers operating on, gut instinct with their decision making, or simply stuck in a routine of calendar of events on prior experiences, because that's what you do at that time of year.
Yeah.
And certainly at some of the agronomy groups that we've been to, it's very satisfying to hear agronomists say, look, I've just heard from one client that normally sows wheat on the 1st of May every year, and this year he's not doing that.
Yeah.
It's the first time he's ever not sown wheat, and off the back of a really dire forecast in 2019. So the information we've got, you can never have too much information when it comes to understanding the climatic influences in your area. For example, in the cotton industry, we've got the ENSO Madoki index, which is closely watched now that we understand that it has a profound impact on our area at certain times of the year. That's one example. And you go further north, where the irrigation sector is opening up in the Gulf region, and further up into Northern Territory, where the Madden-Julian oscillation and certainly other key drivers like the IAD and such, and the MJO are having an impact up there. It's understanding that and communicating that. So the ongoing R&D is highly valuable. I think obviously there's probably a pipeline of projects there that I'd love to see some of the outcomes of, but the information we've got is also really very, very good and underutilized.
Yeah, I think this also probably goes some way to answer your question. Shuzing Zhang from UTAS, who was asking about climate data that ag people look forward to and how they use them to improve their harvest. There seems to be a lot more potential ways they could be used on farm in some cases, but also great to hear that you have those examples of farmers that normally go, well, the 1st of May is when I do this, and it's the second week of July, and after the winter solstice, there are so many, and those have been methods for avoiding and reducing risk in the past, when they felt like agriculture and the seasons and the climate felt a bit more predictable, but they end up becoming things that increase risk now that there's increased variation, and now that we've got climate changing. So as far as, there's been so many great questions from everyone. I have a question for all of you, and that is, I wanted to ask about whether you get enough support for your work, and is there something that government or industry or policymakers could do more to support what you do? Is there anything that you think needs to change? I might start with you, John.
Oh, that's a question I can talk to for a fair while, actually. That each agricultural sector, so be it cotton, grains, sugar, etc., used to come together and co-fund climate research in a vehicle called MCV, standing for Managing Climate Variability. That vehicle has been dismantled after 25 years, and there's meant to be a new formation of collaboration overseen by the Department of Agriculture in Canberra, and we're waiting on that transition. And we've basically had a 2-year drought with no collaborative ag funding, and it's just been a very painful wait. Given the lead time on research projects, procurement, and research itself, and then disseminating the results, 2 years is a long time to be doing nothing. Yeah. And I just wish that process would speed up. There's researchers have come up with some really novel, high impact research projects that would make a huge difference to us, and they've kind of got no natural buyer for those, or no natural project administrator for those research ideas to come through to fruition, and it's a painstaking wait for that to change at the moment.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, because we can't think about these long-term issues that have short-term impacts in ways that are fragmented in terms of how they get support and how they're overseen. Yawen, is there anything in your work that you think you'd like to see change, or do you get enough support for the research that you're doing?
I think currently, because my work is all about method development, and in our center, I have got enough expertise in working out the theory for developing these new techniques for the projection post-processing. And for the other aspects, I will say like just like what I have mentioned, we are interested in understanding what type of climate conditions or climate indices are important to farmers and the whole agricultural systems. And we are also eager to know the perfect conditions for the crop growth, like what Pandora just commented. And we would like to know, and we would like to establish any effective communication between our climate scientists and the farmers to know their particular requests and needs.
Yep. Yeah. Having that improvement in the two-way communication between climate scientists and farmers is a good suggestion for things that'd be great to see more of. Jason, how about you?
Well, so I've obviously been in the research environment at a university here for a few decades, and it's clear that with our climate changing faster now than it has been any time in the last century, that there's more questions that need research than researchers to look at them at the moment. Certainly having cuts in the research budgets over the last decade by the federal government has not helped that in any way. And I think, John's example of the end of the Managing Climate Variability program is just a really clear example of where these cuts in research budget have really hurt industries that could have been moving forward over the last few years, but have basically lost a key source of information or improvements in information. And these are things that aren't hard to reverse.
Yep.
These can be reversed. I guess we have a new government and we're yet to see exactly where they're going to be focusing, but certainly they are saying more positive things around climate change, understanding climate change, research into climate change and the impacts it's having on various industries, including agriculture. So I'm quite hopeful that we will see some sort of successor to the MCV program quite soon, hopefully. And it's programs like that that really connect the researchers to the industries.
Yep.
So missing that kind of program has really sort of left that gap between some of the research we're doing and the applications of that research within industry. So it's one of the reasons we really do need those kind of programs back up and running and being successful.
There you go. So if you're listening and you've got any influence over that, there seems to be shared enthusiasm to see this change from climate scientists and farmers. Pandora on YouTube has said, like what Yawen alluded to, that it would be useful to know what perfect conditions are. Then we could check for how often they occur in our data sets. And I think she means from BOM. John, what are some places that someone working in BOM could look to find out what perfect conditions look like to your industry? I know that they're very different for, different crops, different livestock. But yeah, where would you suggest?
Oh, certainly. Look, there's been a number of papers done by, Svi Hockman from UQ and others. That's one example. Peter Heyman, that have used crop growth simulation models to determine yield outcomes, and they run a hindcast over, say, 25 years. And you'd simply have to cherry pick one of those years where you had a rip-roaring bell ringer of a yield to know that, why was that? And then you could, forensically interrogate the temperature and rainfall conditions for that. Even just the summer gone, we've seen sorghum yields over the previous summer in northern New South Wales here eclipse even irrigated sorghum yields in any other year. We've seen yields of 10 to 12 tonnes to the hectare around which is just completely unheard of. So there's a good example of perfect conditions and leaving farmers grinning from ear to ear, wondering what they've just experienced and how often it'll be until they see it again. But certainly 2021-22 is a summer cropping year from heaven. That's one example. And 2020 was also a year where winter cropping yields were just eclipsed, off the back of deep mineralisation through the profile and having lots of N, and then really timely rain events through 2020 and a dry harvest period in November. So there's another example. For livestock, I guess, continual rain and not too extreme in terms of temperature, ideal for pasture growth. There'd be a good few years where you could find some analogues where those pasture growing conditions could be seen as optimal. So yeah, there's a few examples, hopefully for Pandora.
Yeah. I reckon on your calendar, say, write down, such and such, sowing such and such happens around this time in these areas, and lambing typically happens in these areas at these times, and it'd be a good exercise for anyone who's talking weather publicly, to have that in mind. Bring your raincoat is not the only thing that your audience needs to know. Craig Bishop, along these lines, your question might have already been answered in what John said, Craig, but Craig said, do farmers have weather-driven crop models that predict yield? And obviously that paper is one example. Craig said, these would serve as very useful metrics or indices for the impact of climate change on ag. One thing I also wanted to point out, that yield isn't the only thing that farmers care about. You can have very high yield, but very low prices, because everyone's got high yield and very low quality. And when you think, my family are sheep farmers, they're wool producers, then you've got completely different things that come into play, and different people shear at different times as well. So those, I think, it's interesting to think about these things, but it's not just yield, I guess, is one message. Although that's often a common science one. We're going to improve yield to feed the world, which is, noble as well, if there are any crop scientists watching. Do you have anything to add to that, Jason?
Well, I guess to answer Craig, then yes, there are weather-driven crop models for many different types of crops, and there are a number of us in the field who have been working with crop modelers to do exactly what he's suggesting here, looking at how future changes in climate are going to impact the yield. Largely is what these models are predicting. So I think predicting the quality is a harder thing to do. But one thing that has been found is that, of course, one of the things that's happening as the climate's changing, or causing the climate to change, is increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere. And this does have a fertilization effect on plants, including crops. But for a number of different crops, what they've found is that in the higher CO2 environment, the food component, so the fruit of the plant, or the grain, while being growing faster or being bigger because of the CO2 enhancement, it actually has lower nutrition per weight, because what it's growing more of the non-nutrition part of the fruit or the seed. So there's a quality impact there as well.
Important things to think about. I think sometimes, having been a country bumpkin and a city slicker, you kind of see the divide in how people assume, what people assume farmers want from the weather, and the reality, like, oh, wonderful rain, the farmers will be happy. Meanwhile, a bunch of farmers are crying because, it's ruined everything. It's ruined their whole year. It's not just about how much rain, it's about, how much rain over how much time. There are so many different things. John also offering a website that we might get someone to copy paste into the chat there, on on climate and crop model. Is it armonline.com.au?
Yeah, that's right. There's a very simplistic model there, but it's free. It's something you don't have to subscribe to, which is funded by the Queensland government. And you can run crop nutrition, variety, and climate choices. There are 5 different climate parameters you can set, and it's very, very easy to navigate. And we always use that at the end of a climate risk session, where we look at the forecast and then and superimpose those the outlook into that crop model with various starting soil moisture parameters, and it's just a really, really good tool where the rubber hits the road and people sort of leave the meeting going, oh yeah, well that's kind of about where we can expect a range of crops this year, and if the thresholds are too low, well they do something else with the land, either fallow it or do something else.
Yeah, that's a great example, and a great example about how all of this, all of this modeling and all of this really complex behind the scenes work that people like Yowen and Jason might do can actually be applied to a tool that people can use and apply to what they do. That's a great note for us to lead into our final question, because we are coming up to the end of the hour already. It flew by very quickly. My final question for you all is about the future. What do you think is important for the future, and what would a best case scenario look like for you? I'll start with you, Yowen.
Yeah, I feel like for the future for our climate scientists, we would like to get more predictions and the uncertainty quantification for the future climate scenarios. So in our class, many researchers are working hard to develop new techniques to reach that goal. And I think for the future, another important thing is we would like to encourage the connection between the end users and the science community, and we would like to encourage the effective communication between the scientists and the farmers to make the farmers better understand the climate conditions and make them more efficiently do their own long-term planning for their farms.
Yeah, great point. Thank you so much for that. And how about you, Jason? What's the future look like, or the best case scenario?
Well, I would hope that what we're going to see in the future is sort of an atmosphere that's more conducive to funding research in climate and the connections between the changes we're seeing and impacts on various industries like agriculture. And so that means, a reinvigoration of programs like the Managing Climate Variability program was when it was around and active, but also new support for forums to encourage that communication between the scientists, climate scientists, and agricultural industry people, and people who, from the science side, we often call knowledge brokers, but from agriculture might be called extension officers, who have as their key part of their job to bridge that gap between the knowledge and practice in the agriculture industry, and the knowledge that we're gaining through research into climate science, climate change, and the local and regional impacts of that.
Yeah, sounds like it'll be a great future. And how about you, John? What's important to you for the future?
What's important for me when I'm thinking about the future and farmers and agriculture, it's a little bit akin to purchasing a second-hand car. We can deal with what we know, but the really frightening thing is what we don't know about the future. And I think it's really important that we have close links with researchers, much closer. We need to be, in lockstep with information as it comes to hand, and we need to be able to. Well, industries need to resource their extension in this, really critical field. I mean, you can have the shiniest tractors and the most beautiful farms, but unless we understand the climate in more detail, I think there's definitely exposure in terms of business risk in the future, and that can be offset by, as you say, links and resourcing of these areas where we know that there's deficits or deficiencies.
Yeah, great. And it's wonderful to hear from the three of you throughout this, from your different perspectives and the different things you do every day. There are these overlaps. So what we've been hearing throughout, to sum up, is that we need more links between agriculture and scientists, and we're also hearing that there is enthusiasm for that on both sides, but bodies and people that facilitate that. And definitely hearing that there is a need and an interest in the agriculture industry in making use of this data, and from the scientists in making use of the knowledge and the expertise of what farmers have to say as well. Thank you so much to all of you, for all three of you, for coming along. Thank you so much to anyone who pre-submitted a question or who was writing in the chat as well, watching live or watching back. Thank you very much. That's all from us today. This has been a panel from the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. We hope it's been useful to you all. Maybe just before we sign off, you can all let people know a place they can have a look for more information that you might want to let them know. Jason, do you have one?
Well, you can always check out the Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes website. That'll direct you towards a whole bunch of different information sources. And as I mentioned earlier, all the state governments do have web presences around the regional climate change happening or expected to happen in their states. And there's a lot of really useful information through those sites as well. So I'd recommend people checking those out.
Awesome. Thanks very much. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. That's us signing off, and have a lovely day wherever you are. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.